Okay, I think I've met most everybody, but my name is Bob Hutmacher. I'm with University of California. I don't know where to say I'm located now. I'm at Westside part of the time. We have a number of projects at Kearney, and I still have a lab and a bunch of employees located down at Chapter in Kern County, so kind of all of the above. What I was going to do is there are a couple handouts going around. One of them is the nice fancy one. You can tell it had industry input. It was produced, we put together information along with the California Cotton Growers Association and Ginners Association, and then worked with some of the folks from Phytogen, Dow, on putting together the handout, which is a much fancier, updated version of what we've had out for a number of years, covering some of the issues with Race 4 Fusarium. So I'm going to just cover a little bit of refreshers on this. I think everybody's heard about this maybe ad nauseum, but it's certainly quite a few times over the years. It hasn't gone away. It's pretty much one of those things that's endemic. It's everywhere in the San Joaquin Valley where we grow cotton. What's different as of about 2 weeks ago is that we've been involved in some national surveys, kind of keeping our eyes out for this because it is one of those things that's potentially seed-borne, can be introduced with soil a number of different ways. It has been confirmed that it's out in the El Paso area of Texas now. So they have confirmed Race 4 Fusarium out in West Texas. Not in the main production area of the Texas High Plains, but again, it certainly has their concern level up. Anyway, we talked about this on a lot of different occasions in the past. I wanted to hit kind of a few things that I think are important as reminders. And a lot of this is covered in that handout as well. But again, Race 4 it's a distinct pathogen. Once only in California. It really came to our attention because it is different than Race 1 Fusarium in that while it's worse if it's also present along with root knot nematode, it doesn't require a root knot nematode in order to be present. So that's why we see it in every soil type. We've seen it in clays, lake bottom ground, sandy loams, everything. So, and once it's there, it pretty much is there for the long haul. We have a standard test that the industry, Growers Association and others helped fund some work with AgDia, and there's also a larger scale laboratory macroarray approach that we can use for doing evaluations. It's much simpler to test plant tissue than to do soil tests. And by my way of thinking, trying to randomly do something with soil tests and say, thumbs up, I don't have it, or thumbs down, I do, is sort of a needle in a haystack type of thing, and you're much better, I think, spending your efforts looking at something you think might be suspicious as a plant in order to identify whether there's something there in the field. Again, it's potentially seed-borne. We do know quite a bit about what type of things do help control it or don't help control it. It can be, especially if you collected seed like directly off of plants that you know to be infected or that you're fairly easily identified as having symptoms, then those particular types of plants would have a real high probability that there would be spores actually on the seed surface in those bowls, especially in the lower canopy of those plants. And the good news is all of those surface spores are pretty much controlled by time, dehydration, and standard fungicide treatments that are done on all planted seed. So it'd be an argument for not brown bagging seed, but the standard, acid delinting and fungicide treatments and everything is going to kill, darn near 100% of any of the pathogens that would be on the surface. The problem is that in cases where you would say collect planting seed, there's literally like a 1 in a million or 1 in 5 million type of probability that if you collected planting seed directly from an infected seed, probably where you could actually see the symptoms, then there would be some spores that would be internal under the seed coat. Those are not controlled by any of the standard acid delinting practices, and so it's always a very remote possibility that yes, we can have it survive and have potential to go from there. It survives in the soil, it survives in plant parts. The conidia are really short-lived spores. They're fairly easy. You'll have massive quantities of conidia, but they'll die pretty easily. when they're exposed to dehydration or solar radiation in the surface parts of the soil. But there's a nasty thing called a chlamydospore, which is literally one of those decades-long type of survivor spores that's also produced. And those, when they get incorporated with disking or any kind of cultural practice, even if they're actually darn near or right on the soil surface, they'll survive probably for at least years. And if they're protected deeper in the soil, they'll probably survive for decades. The bad news, and again, is that it's dispersed by any kind of practice that moves infested soil water. We went through a period where people wanted to have a lot of arguments that, you know, everything was you want to blame on the seed. And that's really not true in our experience. If you have tailwater recovery systems that I'm used to people saying, you know, best thing you could do, a place like the San Joaquin Valley, actually the spores, especially the chlamydospores on plant residues, survive very nicely going through a tailwater system. They can survive for probably a couple weeks at least in a sump underwater, and then they get transported out to another field as part of your tailwater recovery system, and then you just spread the pathogen to wherever you sent that water. So plant residues, one of the things I always argue, the Australians have a very aggressive program because of, Dan knows more about the Australian production conditions, but they're more of the old style San Joaquin Valley thing where it would be cotton, small grains, cotton, rice, cotton, summer fallow, followed by, you know, something else. And I think one of our biggest problems in the San Joaquin Valley is we'll do something like cotton tomatoes, and the tomatoes, basically the whole harvest operation is a way to make mud and transport things on tires and scatter it all over the place. So I'd argue that particularly a place like Fresno County, I think that's where most of the localized distribution happened, was with all the practices with probably other crops other than cotton. One thing we've answered partially is where in the soil is the highest concentration of the FOV inoculum. And I would say in general you can make some statements that following a summer crop, the highest inoculum concentrations are probably in the upper 6 to 8 inches of the soil profile, and lower below that, significantly lower below that. But if you follow summer fallow or cereal, and then a summer fallow, the highest concentrations are deeper, as you might expect. You've had a system where, again, you've dried out the upper soil surface, you've done some weed control, maybe cultivation operations and all, and that's really lowered some of that inoculum survival. And then the numbers may not be as high as they would in this situation, but that's where you're going to find it. So when you do some kind of, that's one of the reasons why we came up with things like, you know, possibilities of using something like a rolling cultivator as opposed to knives or sweeps or blades, in order to maybe not move as much material back up to the surface or up to where you think you're going to be doing your plantings. Post-plant resistance, or, you know, resistant varieties essentially is the name of the game as far as I'm concerned, but I'm prejudiced because, I mean, this is part of what the seed companies have put a tremendous effort into, folks like Joel Mayhill from Phytogen and his crew, and Jim Olvey with Monsanto and Delta Pine and Olvey Associates. You know, I've made a lot of progress with commercial materials. Mauricio Yo with USDA ARS is working with us on a lot of public materials, and we've done quite a few releases into PIMAs. I'd say there's good progress in ID. If you're a PIMA grower, there's a lot of choices there of highly resistant varieties, and that's actually really good news for being able to deal with this pathogen. Uplands, we're still working on this. The seed companies are doing the same thing. There's much more of an emphasis. My guess is that finding it in Texas will light even more of a fire under people to put even more effort into the upland efforts for finding good levels of host plant resistance. The way you do a lot of this stuff early on is not all transgenic. A lot of this has been going through essentially the world collection of cotton, looking for materials that are highly resistant. And just to show you a little bit of what you're up against, about 10 or 12 years ago, the Australians were talking tremendously about their, you know, downs, and I'm trying to remember what the other one is. They have two really serious Fusarium oxysporum races in Australia that were really doing a tremendous amount of damage. And so we got their best performing materials with their Australian strains, and we sent them what at the time were our best performing PIMAs. And we've done several comparisons since then. And their best materials don't help at all on race 4. Our best race 4 resistant materials don't do anything for theirs. So again, this is one of those sort of ongoing battles as you identify these pathogens. Then you have to figure out, in addition, are these ones that will perform well under, say, verticillium exposure? So again, it's a kind of ongoing battle, and I expect that's why it's really a big deal to have the seed companies engaged in this on a large scale. Other hosts or impacted crops. The basic thing is that this is a saprophyte, so there's multiple weed and crop, essentially alternate hosts or places where the pathogen can survive, but only susceptible cotton cultivars that are economically effective hosts. I'm really used to the question. I'm going to go into a different rotation, namely almonds or pistachios. Are they affected by race 4 Fusarium? The answer is no. So, rotation crop impacts. I would say that in general there aren't any miracle rotation crops that really knock and tremendously suppress the survival of this pathogen, so it's quite different than verticillium. Verticillium, I think almost everybody's used to the idea that you can do even a 1-year small grain rotation, and it's not a miracle, but it really suppresses the verticillium problems. And we haven't found that really with Fusarium race 4. The impacts are about twice as severe following rotation with winter grains or legumes as opposed to like beans or alfalfa compared to summer fallow. And it's about 1.5 times or so worse than with corn, sorghum, or cotton the prior summer compared with summer fallow. Again, so I think a lot of people had the experiences with the drought and everything that you'd have a field that'd be completely taken out of cotton production and all. And you knew it was a problem, 2 years earlier, and then the problem seemed like it'd go away. And I guess my comments would be it doesn't go away, but it makes sense that it's less of a problem. And then if you change cultivars to a more resistant cultivar, well then again, that was a good choice, and that's part of what's going on. So again, I think a number of these kind of practices combined with making choices of available more resistant cultivars is really the name of the game. One of the things that you might read if you go through some of the literature down in Australia, and I don't know of anybody that would put up with this here, is the idea that after you, say, finish with a prior crop, they've seen some real improvement by going through, like with a grain crop, and cutting the residue practically right at ground level, and then leaving it exposed for probably 6 to 8 weeks on the top. And that's helped quite a bit in terms of reducing the inoculum load going back into the soil when you cultivate and put all those materials back in. But I don't know about everybody else. I'm used to getting chased across the field by growers, saying, I just harvested and now I'm going to disc or I'm going to do whatever, get out of my way. And so I don't know how many people would be willing to say, yes, leave that as it is for, 2 months essentially. Chemical treatments. The bottom line, soil treatments, seed treatments, in-furrow treatments, things that have been tested in California at least largely are ineffective. You can say that you can also almost add if they're economically reasonable, then they're largely ineffective. If you want to go out there and do methylbromide chloropicrin, if you want to do the highest rate Vapam, it will seriously suppress the pathogen and help knock it down a lot. We had some pretty good success with Vapam, but again, a lot of these are either too expensive or they're ones that you have to really kind of pick and choose whether that's how you want to use something like Metam. They won't eradicate it, and again, the high-end chemical treatments are not economically viable. There's been quite a bit of work on amendments, so if you have heard or think of using gypsum, urea, manures, humates, micronutrient mixes, biologicals such as trichoderma, a whole bunch of those type of things have all been tested and haven't looked to be particularly promising. And I wouldn't dissuade anybody from using anything that you think you can see or verify that you have a response. I just wouldn't necessarily be convinced until somebody proved it to me. If they say it cures it or it eradicates it, I would be very suspicious. And I don't in any way say that there isn't some, real valid. I think part of what happens with Fusarium with a lot of of root impacting diseases is anything, relief of compaction, control of other pathogens, changes in planting dates, to give the plant a better chance to establish. Anything that makes the root system more healthy and larger probably is going to help with Fusarium. And so I wouldn't discount anything anybody tells you right up until they tell you that it will cure it and you won't have the problem again. I don't believe it. So anyway, I think that is about enough, other than this is another one of those that with what Dan just talked about. The Australians talk a lot about planting date effects, and we've seen this and experienced this in California as well. Later plantings under warmer, drier conditions, lower incidence of other diseases, almost always results in less incidence of FOV4 and lower mortality and less impact on yields. And the problem with that is usually if you're trying to grow Pima with just barely enough growing season, or you'd like to plant early so that you can avoid late season insect problems, whitefly and everything else that we're concerned about, then telling somebody again go for the latest possible planting date. Again, it works to some degree. It won't cure it, but again, you've got to weigh it against the downside of a late planting date. Okay, and I think that's all I have on Fusarium.
Hey Bob, a few years ago, there was a concept that if you were a grower and you just saw, like typically you'll just see that one small spot in the field the first time, say 8-10 foot square, that if you would go out and cover that with a certain thickness of plastic and put dirt all around the edges, and the cotton's a foot tall or 18 inches tall, whatever, and that plastic just sits on there for how many months, that area would be sanitized pretty well. Is that still thought of as a tool?
It definitely works. Rebecca Bennett and some folks, when they were here with the USDA down in Chapter, they did some field trials down, and they published them down in Kern County. And solarization worked really well on controlling the pathogen. What they did was load up these little bags that you put in the field with a certain amount of inoculum in them, and you can bury them at different depths and then do a soil treatment over the top of everything. They worked really well on probably about the top 10 to 12 inches under San Joaquin Valley conditions. And to me, it's sort of a, the biggest problem I think with that concept is that usually by the time you have damage, Fusarium is an inoculum population dependent disease. So the problem is usually in the field what there is the pathogens there. You don't see hardly anything going on out in the field. Then you start seeing maybe a couple plants. Then maybe the next year you see a larger area where the plants died at the seedling stage and you have a little stunting. Then you have a bigger area the size of the swimming pool. Well, by the time it's the size of the swimming pool, you've maybe done 2 or 3 major field cultivation operations or more through that area. And you've already likely, unless you're in a complete no-till situation, you've probably done a pretty good job of dragging things through there. I've got a picture that is sort of a nice opportunity. I don't want to call it a good picture because it's actually horrifying, but we took an aerial view of a field where a grower had the pathogen in an area about the size of this covered area here in year 1, and it was in cotton. Then they rotated to tomatoes, and it was one of those fields where they cross-dissed and then they changed the row direction. So then they took the problem that was here, and then they dragged it lengthwise this way through the field by changing the row direction. And then when they went back to cotton 2 years later, they changed the row direction and went back the other way. So they basically went smear, smear, and spread it over the whole blasted field. In about a 3-year period, they basically transferred it to most of a 160-acre field. And so it's very difficult to do an early treatment that's done at the right time. But one of the best ones I've seen was somebody in Fresno County who actually went into a field, and what they did was they had a pretty linear thing in the field, and they knew how they tilled that ground. And they went in and they put a double line of sprinklers and did a meadow application. And they basically just blasted that area. And they killed the cotton plants in that area and took that part out. But it did a remarkably good job of knocking down the population. And in some ways, I still think that the best practice is anything that sort of suppresses the expansion of it combined with a resistant cultivar means that gradually over time, the population just kind of keeps declining. And if you're worried about saying, you know, I want it gone, well, forget it. You know, it isn't going to happen. But if you're worried about reducing it to where it's not an economic impact with a resistant cultivar, I think that's really doable, especially in Pimas. I think you're already there with Pimas. And, you know, multiple companies, not just Phytogen, but Phytogen and Dow, and I think Bayer's working on it also, have, you know, what I would call really quite resistant cultivars in Pimas. Hopefully more options in uplands to come soon. Okay.
More questions for Bob?
And I'll just mention real briefly the other handout that I have, you know, so that I don't want to dig into too much of Pete's time, because I think this is definitely a year where I think most people want to hear Pete. On the nitrogen management handout, I put together some of that kind of in response to some of the questions that Dan and I have been getting by participating in all these nitrogen discussions over the last couple of years. And so one of the things that we're, you know, resistant to doing, but that we're talking about doing on one of the last pages was some of the, I think on page 4, there's a chart there that shows some of the values that we have for plant nitrogen uptake and plant removal with harvest that are some of the questions that they're looking at, you know, probably for potential regulatory impacts. And the reason why I wanted to just sort of put that there for you to look at is that there's quite a range in the numbers that we've looked at, and we haven't had a lot of studies that were designed specifically to answer that question. So we're trying to be kind of resistant and not particularly willing to put a specific number and say this is the number for Pima or this is the number for upland. We think it's sort of a family of numbers, and we may end up using some of the variety trial type of situations to maybe come up with some more realistic numbers.
Thank you, Bob. And the other thing that I think is real important in this publication that Bob's organized is the leaf petiole values and sort of some guidelines out there for the petioles on nitrate. So that's really something that you know, we have data. Could we have more? Yes. But we've also wanted in-season guidelines for nitrogen management in the Pima cottons. We've had an abundance of data over the years for uplands, and now we've got some good data organized. And I appreciate you putting that together, Bob, because it's really something about in-season management. We don't have a precise window, and these aren't really hard and fast. But you'll see Bob did a nice job of setting out some ranges that you can consider in terms of your nitrates.
I think if you're below the ones where it says borderline or deficient, borderline in a lot of situations is just fine. Especially because some of these, you know, like peak bloom to some people, and you're like this one too, especially is not a very distinct time period. Just sort of a range of times. Might be, you know, this year it might be early August with some of the losses. The Pima numbers, if you notice, are significantly different. We've known that for a long time. We've kind of talked about it in general, but this is the range from some of the more recent studies, well, more recent being over the last 8 to 10 years in Pima. And the other thing I would add, and then I'll be quiet, is that one of the challenges that I think Dan and I have both had in looking at this kind of data in recent years is that it doesn't all look the same when you throw in subsurface drip or even surface drip irrigated spoon-fed nitrogen applications. And the same thing will probably apply, maybe not for phosphorus, but maybe for potassium to some degree if you're delivering potassium in that same manner. That's why I put this chart up, because again, it drives you crazy. If you're used to front-end loading, okay, I'm going to put on a pre-plant fertilizer application, and then I'm going to do the next half of a split. I'm going to do it just before the first main season irrigation. And that was a fairly common practice for a lot of people and, a lot of different locations and some other crops. And what's more typical with that type of thing is this black curve that I don't show very well here. This is petiole nitrate numbers over time. So part of what's happening is you have a little tiny plant and you have this massive amount of nitrogen that's there when the plant's growing fairly slowly. And then so part of what's going on here is the root system is expanding and it's finding that nitrogen, but the demands are still quite low because you're not producing seed yet, like Dan was talking about. So part of this reduction in these numbers that you see here is basically sort of a dilution effect as the plant grows and you irrigate and all of this stuff happens. So you tend to you look at the old charts and they tend to start really high, like 16, 18,000 parts per million, and then they drop. And it used to be that the early season stuff is what would drive people crazy, because I'd say, well, I measured it last week and it was 19,000. I measured it this week and it's 11,500. And so that's an artifact that goes along with this front-end loading type of approach on relatively small plants. What we've seen in some cases in drip is very little nitrogen or maybe no nitrogen put on up front. So you're just working on sort of what the plants have access to in the upper part of the profile, which is very variable depending on what your prior crop was. So you're following a more heavily fertilized vegetable crop that leaves a fair amount in the top 18 inches. Then you'll see some numbers that are a little higher. But I've seen quite a few situations in my own studies where it actually looks like this dotted line. So it'll start lower, then it'll actually go up as I start injecting the fertilizer and the plant starts to actually have a more expansive root system, and then it'll wander around like this. So again, you have to look at these numbers that are in this chart and realize that, again, I tried to put a little disclaimer in there that if you're doing something in subsurface drip, I wouldn't get too excited about squaring time petiole numbers almost without exception anyway. I think, with all the other places you have to spend your money, I wouldn't even do that. It's more when you start getting closer to first bloom, or very early in after first bloom is probably one of your indicator times. And then around peak bloom, if I was going to do it a second time, it'd be somewhere around peak bloom, especially if you're doing fertigation with drip, because you still have an opportunity if you've got a great, nice fruit load and you see that you're looking a little bit lower than what you want, well, then you can do something about it. Or even if it's furrow irrigated, you could do at least a light water run. And so I think, in the interest of spending your money well, maybe those two timings. And if you got a different opinion, Dan, I just think, most people, they don't want to show this whole chart. They want to pick a couple times where it might pay off.
Bob, could you talk a little bit about the differences in nitrate content in the xylem versus the phloem, and kind of reflection of what it is that we're actually reading with petiole levels?
With petioles, almost all of the nitrate in the plant is actually moving in the xylem. It's moving in the water conducting tissue. And so part of the reason why they decided a long time ago to look at something like petioles is that you're actually, once you have root hairs developed, very early on roots do a very poor job of taking up nitrate, but as soon as you have a sort of a network of root hairs developed, well, then the nitrate can come in by that mechanism and it comes into the water stream. So it kind of makes sense if you think about it, as the plant starts developing some leaf area and it's moving more water, and it also has the potential to move more nitrogen and has that kind of setup for movement. So it's probably 90–95% of the nitrate that is moved in the xylem, at least over the longer distances in the plant. And so what it is it's sitting up there in the petiole while it's waiting for sort of enzyme reactions to occur so it can be converted into amino acids. And that's why it's sort of a short-term kind of pool that you can measure that gives you kind of a snapshot of what's going on in the plant. And so it does matter, to some extent, if you are trying to compare data across, different parts of the field and you take data in the morning versus the afternoon, there's reasons for it to matter. Because again, the enzyme, the nitrate reductase enzyme that's involved in actually doing something with that nitrate is affected by carbohydrate status in the plant. And so if you've got water stress and you've got a bunch of other things going on there, if you really want to be consistent, you probably ought to, again, it's a good thing to take in the morning hours, you know, when the plant's had a certain amount of recovery and you don't have all these other interactions going on. So I don't know, is that
Yeah, I think.
kind of makes sense? So I mean, there's a lot of variation in what people will tell you to do or not do. I mean, I think I'm kind of almost more along the lines that if I'm looking at or worried about potassium, I think the data in general would say that, and maybe Dan's got a comment, but I think in general, I think the data would say that leaf blades are a better thing to measure if you're looking for potassium issues. And I think petioles are better, or at least a little bit easier to consistently get readings if you're looking for nitrate or nitrogen. You know, you can look at total leaf blade nitrogen content as well, but I don't think it's as sensitive as petiole nitrate. You'll find plenty of disagreements in the literature about that. So,
How long after first bloom do you consider peak bloom? About 3 weeks or so, or?
the question is the difference in time between first bloom and peak bloom, and yeah, I mean probably 2.5 to 3 weeks in uplands, and you can add another week to that a lot of times in the Pimas. And the Pimas are a real frustration to me because, you know, it's not unusual, I don't think, to have, you know, a 45, 50-day period where you can really, all of that can be important to try and, if you're aiming for 4 bale plus yields. And I think that's one of the, and then I'll be quiet. one last thing, I think that, again, I keep pointing to Dan because seeing him reminds me. We've talked a bunch of times about the fact that nobody is happy with a 2 1/4 bale yield anymore, and that won't work for them. Means that all of the pressures for, you know, what you need in terms of fruit retention and what you need in terms of nutrient availability are still really intense. So people would like you to tighten up and be really careful with nitrogen applications, but you still need enough. So you need some way of making sure that you can still get something on the plant. And I think the same thing is true increasingly with potassium, is the drip irrigated stuff, at least for me, within the last 5 years, it's the first time I have ever seen potassium deficiency in like Panoche clay loam deep soils. And I blame it all on what I've worked on for a long time, subsurface drip irrigation and a restricted root zone. So you're trying to build a 5 bale plant, and you've got 200, you know, you got, you know, probably at least 140 pounds of N per acre that you're going to remove with the seed crop on that field, and you're doing it with a smaller root zone. So the deep exploration that used to be possible, you know, in these soils, which a lot of times test out as being quite high in potassium, it's really the root system, you know, and I still think that's a lot of the potassium issues that we saw in the past. A lot of times you could explain, it drive people crazy to have all the potassium strip tests that we used to do with big broadcast fertilizer applications. Then you get no response 1 year, and on the same ground with similar yields, you get a completely different response the next year. And I think it's often related to root system development and just anything that affected the root system 1 year to another. So again, to me,
And you can expect something similar even in the clay, those heavy
Yeah.
oxalis % clays. You can expect a similar situation in the sandy soils, so across the soil types.
Yeah, and
like Bob says, it's really uncommon to see that impact in a really deep, good clay loam soil.
and I'm used to the old days when people would, you know, as a student, when people would practically slap you one when you'd said that you were looking for a potassium response, and they'd say there's enough potassium in there for the next 1,000 years. Well, that's fine, but it's fixed. So anyway, it's just something to keep an eye open for, because I think in a lot of ways the industry's kind of either changed to cultivars, or they've done things like increased manure applications and all, where a lot of the potassium issues that we saw maybe 15, 20 years ago have really lessened, or we've gotten out of some of those soils. But it's still out there when you're pushing it for 4 or 5 bale yields. So anyway, okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bob.